We'll switch to the Press Club in Canberra and my colleagues
better
there.
Put something in my ear.
Yes, we've got some questions. While we're just sorting out Mr Keating's earpiece, the first question today will be from Phil Curry from the Financial Review.
Thanks, Laura. I hope you can hear me, Mr Keating. Look, Richard Marles, perhaps in anticipation of your comments today, in defending yesterday's announcement, said, "We have witnessed in our region the single biggest conventional military build-up anywhere in the world since the end of the Second World War." He says to not respond to that is to be condemned by history. Could I just ask you to clarify, do you think we should not respond to it at all, or we're responding in the wrong way?
We're responding in the wrong way. The Collins-class boat, which I built with Kim Beazley, was a boat designed in the defence of Australia. It was designed to present the continental lands of Australia and to repel any invasion of us. What these boats are, and this is what I don't think the Defence Minister is telling you, is that these boats are designed to sit off the continental shelf of China and sink American nuclear-capable, weapons-capable submarines. Now, I'll just make this point to you. China's peripheral waters, let's make this point that people may not know. About 100 miles off the Chinese coast, there's a plateau. It's a very shallow plateau, right? Very shallow plateau. Any American nuclear-armed sub's got to get across that plateau before they get to the deep water. So the Americans said, we can have, like ducks in a shooting gallery, we will shoot them out before they can get to the deep water. But in the Chinese shallow water, the Chinese have it absolutely loaded with sensors and with equipment to detect large submarines. An 8,000-tonne submarine is going to be visible in a second with the Chinese coming across it. So our submarines are going to be susceptible. Our submarines are going to be in the peripheral waters of China, where the platforms and sensors are most concentrated, right? So while the Americans think they can shoot Chinese submarines like ducks in a barrel, the Chinese can also shoot our submarines because we're in the shallow water and we are detectable, right? So this is a strange way to be defending Australia, to have your submarines sunk on the Chinese continental shelf, chasing Chinese submarines, where in fact with the Collins model, you had, and if the numbers are right, 45 or 50 conventional submarines around the coast of Australia saying, put a step over our finger, we'll punch your lights out. That's the better defence policy for Australia than joining with the Americans up there in the shallow waters of the Chinese coast trying to knock out. See, look, you know this, Phil, you may know this. The Chinese in the air-sea battle plan they had 8 or 10 years ago was whether they could knock out all the Chinese nuclear weapons in one strike. And people doubt that this can happen. You know, you can find the sites and knock them out. All states. So what big states do is they have submarines in deep water that carry the same nuclear weapons that are not subject to a strike. It's called a second strike capability. What the Americans are trying to do is deny the Chinese a second strike capability. And we'd be the mugs up there helping them. You know, we'd be up there saying, oh no, we'll put our boats into jeopardy in the shallow waters of China. Instead of, what is our aim in life? It is to protect the continent of Australia. Border with no one, shallow waters, we don't need 8,000-tonne submarines. Collins was 4. We could have 50 Collins-class boats and 15 at sea, and we'd have a much stronger defence than this rubbish that the government's doing.
So you might like to adjust your earpiece again, Mr Keating, while we get ready for the next question, which is from Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times.
Thank you, Mr Keating. I want to draw you towards Indonesia, a place I lived for 2 years. You visited many times as Prime Minister. In 1995, you signed the landmark security deal with Indonesia, and a year later in Singapore, you talked of the great uncertainty with China. On Indonesia, could you talk to the impact the AUKUS agreement will have on the Australia-Indonesia relationship?
Well, look, I've said before many times, Australia's strategic bread is buttered in the Indonesian archipelago. A major attack on them, and the only people who could attack them majorly would be the Chinese, would affect us, whether we liked it or not. And a major attack on us would affect them. So this is why I put the agreement together with Suharto. An attack on any one of us was an attack on all of us. So what wise governments do is they put safety things in place. You know, you don't sit there waiting for someone to hit you over the head to think, hang on, I better put a few defences up here. So Indonesia is central to our security, our long-term security, and not that I expect, let me repeat, I don't expect any Chinese military assaults upon the Indonesian archipelago or us, but nevertheless a prudent country running a defence policy, which is what I've done in the years I was in office, would be to have that archipelago at least, you know, capable of not intrusion by, let's call it, a negative power. Now, but you see, what the difference is, what Anthony Albanese has done this week, he screwed into place the last shackle in the long chain which the Americans have laid out to contain China. We are now part of a containment policy against China. You know, we've got Japan, the US, ourselves, and India, right? And buying these subs was like Anthony Albanese screwing up the shackle to make sure all the chains are connected. That's what we're doing. Instead of doing a more sensible thing, say, look, our bread is buttered in Southeast Asia. It's Southeast Asia that matters. It's Indonesia which matters. Let's get along. I mean, the Chinese don't want to attack anybody. They don't want to attack us, and they don't want to attack the Americans, and they don't want to attack the Indonesians. So what is all this? It's only about one matter only: the maintenance of US strategic hegemony in East Asia. This is what this is all about. You know, and I go back to the point I made to Laura. If the US has no continental land in East Asia, how does it suspect or argue that it can remain the strategic superpower? Because if it all turns badly, it'll be just like Afghanistan and Iraq. The Americans will pull out and leave the mess behind. They would just go back to San Diego, 10,000 kilometres, and leave us with the consequences. You know, that would be the outcome.
Andrew Probyn from the ABC has a question.
Mr. Keating, you said before that that China has not threatened Australia, but how do you reconcile that with the fact that they have issued sanctions on coal, timber, wine, lobster, barley, Australian products, that there has been a debt diplomacy employed among our Pacific neighbours, an encroachment of the South China Sea, an effective annexation of some islands, a huge military ramp-up that Laura's asked you about? How is this not, as one a Biden official said this week, undeclared economic and commercial boycott of Australia?
The threat to Australia is a military threat, right? A military threat. It's a threat for the army of the People's Republic of China to come and occupy Australia. That's what a threat is. Like, for instance, a similar threat would be if someone went to occupy Tasmania on us, right? That's what a threat is. Commercial reactions on things like the things you mentioned, they're not strategic. They're not in a threat. You know, I mean, look at what we're doing to them in the WTO and all the steel dumping and all the rest of our stuff. You know, I mean, you know, in the friction of international politics, these things turn up, but they're not threats. You can't impute threat meaning invasion with putting a tariff on wine. Or maybe you're silly enough to think that. You know, do you think you are silly enough to think that?
Mr. Keating, cyber attack.
Well, what, do you think the Americans and the Russians are not into cyber attacks? Who in the world is not into cyber attacks? Or do you think we are not? You know, just remember this. The best friend we had in Asia was a former president of Indonesia, Batu Yudhoyono, you know. He was the best guy we had barracking for us, you know. Those dopes in ACES tapped his telephone and that of his wife. Tapped his phone. I mean, this is what states get up to if you let these security agencies, ning-nongs, take control, you know. But you can't impute, as your question imputes, that a tax or a tariff on wine or barley is equivalent to an invasion of the country. China does not threaten Australia, has not threatened Australia, does not intend to threaten Australia. You can have all these commercial rows you like. We can have diplomatic sort of dust. Remember, this all happened after Maurice Payne, you know, the great non-minister of our time, went on the Insiders program and said we're going to have weapons-type inspections of Wuhan to find out what was the cause of the virus. It was out of that came all of this, you know. So you can't put a question without contexting it, you know. I mean, contextualisation may not be your long suit, but that's what you should be doing.
Olivia Caisley from Sky News.
Olivia Caisley from Sky News. You've described Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defence Minister Richard Marles as seriously unwise in this 9-page document. Unlike present players, you haven't received a military briefing on this issue since the mid-90s. Could you be out of touch on this issue? And given you didn't foresee the military build-up from China as well as intimidation of neighbouring countries when you were in office, what makes you so sure China isn't a military threat to Australia?
Because I've got a brain, principally, and I can think, and I can read, you know, and I read every day, you know. I mean, why would China want to threaten? What would be the point? They get the iron ore, the coal, the wheat. What would be the point of China wanting to occupy Sydney and Melbourne militarily? And could they ever do it? I mean, could they ever bring the numbers here? It would be an armada of troop ships to do it, you know. So you don't need a briefing from the dopey security agency we have in Canberra to tell you that, you know. I mean, I know you're trying to ask a question, but the question is so dumb it's hardly worth an answer.
Well, so do you just let them carry on with their business, whether that be in the Spratly Islands or wherever, you just say, oh, well, they don't plan to attack Australia, so it's all okay?
You know how big what's the other islands we're always talking about? Just look, just pick it up, just go on to Google Maps and have a look at it. It's about as big as Centennial Park, about as large as Centennial Park in Sydney. That's what we're talking about here. You know, I mean, you know, Sky News, you got to dust up your reputation to be on Sky News, you know, and you're probably doing your best to do that.
Thank you.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Keating. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. I just wanted to ask, you've talked a lot about orthodox threats, that being an invasion of Australia, but you know, as my colleagues have said up here, there are many other different types of threats, and particularly for Australia, we're a trading nation. All of our wealth comes in a large part from overseas trade, and that's, you know, similarly to the US interest in Asia. A lot of their trade comes from Asia as well. Shouldn't Australia, you know, work with a partner like the US to protect trade, which is its main economic interest in the region?
This is the United States that would never ever agree at congressional level to ratify the international program on the law of the sea. You realise that, don't you? The US refused to ratify the law of the sea program, right? So that puts a pretty big hole through that question, doesn't it? Secondly, why would the Chinese can't find an alternative supply to Australian iron ore? They've got 30% of their country still to build. We have the highest grade, 63% Fe iron ore, 10 steaming days from their coast. What, do you think they don't want that? You think we need the American military at the Pentagon to make sure our iron ore boats go to China? The Chinese, it's a wonder they don't have a welcome for us out every day one of these damn things turns up, because all that tonnage on their wharves build these Chinese cities. The story of modern China is a story of urbanisation. That's what it is. Urban areas are built with steel. Steel can only be done in China out of Australia. So why would the Chinese want to interrupt their capacity to deal with us? You know, why would we see some donkey in Washington to help us? Yeah.
Jess Malcolm from The Australian.
Thanks, Mr. Keating. I'd like to ask you about the government's proposed changes to super tax concessions and whether you have a position on that.
I'm not doing, this is all about AUKUS. I'm not doing super today. I mean, I've done super since I was a kid.
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
I do have a backup question. I do have a question on China. China's submarine fleet is forecast to grow by 6 nuclear-powered submarines by 2030, and they're building 20 service warships a year, which is even more than the entire Australian fleet. In your opinion, who is being more provocative, Australia or China?
It's not, what the Chinese do in the building of fleet is not provocation. Why do you use the word provocation? That's the wrong word to be using. You know, they're a major state. They have an economy bigger than the United States. They spend about 40% of their national budget on defence. The Americans spend more than the next 9 states in the world on defence. So why is it a provocation? Why would you think it's a provocation for a great state like China to build a navy? Why would you think that? I mean, I just don't accept it. You know, the question's invalid. That's the truth of it, you know.
Thank you.
Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age has a question.
Hi, Mr. Keating. I'll ask 2 parts if I could. You've been extremely critical today of the Albanese government, including Ministers Richard Marles and Penny Wong. Are you concerned that your comments today could represent a fundamental rupture with the party? You've already said that the Prime Minister hasn't responded to your request to brief him on this. And secondly, you have a tremendous skill for invective and criticism. Could I ask you now to turn some of that to the Chinese Communist Party and its treatment of Uyghurs, for example, its treatment of pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong? Will you be similarly critical of them as you are of people in your own party and journalists?
After what you co-wrote with Hartcher last week in that shocking presentation in the Herald on Monday, Tuesday, and when you should hang your head in shame, I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You know, you ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism, you know. I mean, that's the most egregious, the worst, the most biased presentation. You pick up 4 specialists. You could have picked up John McCarthy, a long-term specialist, Alan Gingell. You pick up 4 China hawks, the biggest of them all, Jennings, you know, Davina Lee. These are all China hawks. You represent them to your community as having an independent view, where you know full well that you've selected them to do this thing. And here you are asking me about Uyghurs, and you're asking me about, if I said to you, and I did say when I saw her last time, here's the Prime Minister over, there's everyone over to India, not one question from any one of you about Modi shutting in the Muslims in Kashmir, in the pro-Hindu policies. Nothing.
But there is still a question, Mr. Keating, about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs.
Yeah, well, look, the treatment of the Uyghurs, I'm not to defend China about the Uyghurs. I mean, there's disputes about what the nature of the Chinese affront to the Uyghurs are. There's a dispute about that. But one thing we can't be sure of, what if the Chinese said, but look, what about deaths in custody of Aboriginal people in your prison system? You know, wouldn't that be a valid point for them? Wouldn't it be a valid point? In other words, great power diplomacy cannot be about reaching down into the low social entrails of these states any more than they can with us, you know. But the Sydney Morning Herald, frankly, has lost. It's a newspaper without integrity, and the Age follows it in. Poor little, like a little pup running behind. You know, I mean, if I were you, mate, I'd hide my face and never appear again.
For the record, Mr. Keating, we're very proud of our journalism, and you know we think that's made an important contribution to the national debate. But can I just clarify? Do you think that it really is in dispute about what China has been doing in Xinjiang? It's been very well chronicled by the United Nations, which issued a detailed report last year.
Let me ask you: what do you believe Modi and his Hindu party is doing to the Muslims in Kashmir? If you've got a view on that,
a question about China back to one
because
about India.
because you're not honest enough to recognise that the guy you support, Modi, has the same sort of problems as the Chinese have. You know,
we've reported on problems in India as well, but we're talking about China right now.
No, you don't. You're all a soft touch on India. That's the truth of it.
Just while we're waiting for Maeve Bannister from AOP to ask you a question, could I just follow up on Matthew's question about whether you're concerned about a break with the party?
The party. When I saw Anthony Albanese he asked me at the Kirribilli about a couple of months ago before he saw Xi Jinping. I was the last person to talk to him before he saw Xi Jinping at the G20. And I said, these issues are so big, Anthony. It's a case for me of country before party. You know, I'm not going to have Australia's long-term strategic interests compromised by rubbish in the Labor Party, you know, an understanding, you know, of the issues. In other words, you know, I would have expected him from the left and Penny Wong from the left to have stood up with a position. Look at Labor's great history in China. Gough recognising China in 1972. Hawke was Hu Yabeng, you know, the Chinese Party secretary, and Xiao Ziyang, the premier, you know. The APEC leaders, the APEC meeting. I did the APEC leaders meeting. I talked the Chinese into sitting down with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Could you imagine any of these people getting the Chinese to sit down in APEC with these people? And then there's I then did the deal with Indonesia. Kevin Rudd did the East Asia Summit. You know, we've got this huge, proud history. But Wong drops the whole thing. She drops the whole thing 5 years ago, not to be running a small target policy. There's no way I'm going to let the Liberals wedge me on national security because I'm on the same. Look, I'll tell you a little story. Harcher wrote a book and asked on the back for comments, and Penny Wong was going to attend the book launch with Maurice Payne and was going to add the comments to the back jacket of the book. So I discussed this with, and remember, she's the shadow foreign minister and Harcher is the enfant terrible of this debate, right? She's turning up with that. So I had a discussion with Gareth Evans and Bob Carr about this, and I said, you've got to tell her if she goes to the launch and she puts something in the back of the book, I'm into her. And I think Carr is too. And so she didn't. But you see, this is a small target thing. This is where we've got to, in her administration of the policy. You know, it's terrible.
Maeve Bannister has a question.
Thanks, Mr Keating. Maeve Bannister from the Australian Associated Press. China has criticised the AUKUS Security Pact as Australia disregarding concerns of the international community and being in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the Chinese military itself has nuclear-powered technology capabilities. So is China being hypocritical, do you think, and why shouldn't Australia have that same capability?
Well, we'd have the same capability if we needed it. I think that's the answer. We wouldn't worry about what the Chinese said. I mean, bugger the Chinese, you know. We'd have the same capability if we needed it. My point is we don't need it. We'd be far better off with 45 Collins-class new age submarines in the defence of Australia. So to say, put your toe over our beach and we knock your head off. That's the policy. In other words, we've gone from a defend Australia policy now to a forward defence policy, the old forward defence policy. We're going to sit with a bunch of American submarines off the Chinese continental shelf and try a duck shoot of Chinese nuclear-armed submarines. I mean, this is not the defence of Australia, you know. So if we needed nuclear-armed submarines, nuclear power, we wouldn't take in those what the Chinese said. But the fact is, we just don't need them.
The next question is from Paul Karp.
Thanks very much, Mr Keating. Despite the Albanese government's support for AUKUS, it does appear to have made progress normalising the relationship with China. Could I please ask, is that worth anything, and does that show that a productive economic and political relationship is possible despite AUKUS?
Well, mate, you'd have to be naive to be thinking that, wouldn't you? I mean, you have to, you know. Look, what I said in the speech, I'll try and find it. I said, I'll just find the words. No mealy-mouthed talk of stabilisation. Get the emphasis, mealy-mouthed. Talk of stabilisation in our China relationship or resort to softer or polite language will disguise from the Chinese the extent and intent of our commitment to the United States' strategic hegemony in East Asia with all its deadly portents. Really, I mean, so in other words, they're not going to be as rude as Scott Morrison. They're not going to be as rude as Maurice Payne. They'll talk softly, but by the way, we'll put the last shackle in the chain to contain you. You know, the Chinese say, oh, well, look, thanks for that. I'm glad you're speaking to us more nicely. You know.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, Mr Keating. The next question is from Dan Jarvis-Barty.
Thank you for address, Mr Keating. Dan Jarvis-Barty from the West Australian. Can I ask, how widely held do you think your view is about AUKUS within the Labor Party, both at a grassroots level and among parliamentarians? And if it is widely held, why are you the only one that's speaking up?
Well, generally because I have been championing these issues for, last 30 years. That's a reasonable. I'd say the majority of Labor people would share my view about this. I'd say in those branches of ours, when they work out that we have returned to Britain 230 years after we left, after the British dumped us all through these years, that we're going to bail the British BAE Systems and British aerospace companies and submarine companies out and build their marine for them. I think when the average branch Labor Party member gets onto this, it was like, I think there'll be a big reaction to what the government's doing. I mean, there's no mandate inside the Labor Party, no mandate for what Prime Minister Albanese, Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Richard Marles are doing. No mandate.
The next question is from Julie Hare.
Mr Keating, Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. I'm just a little bit confused and I'd like you to clarify if possible. You say that China is not a threat to Australia, but you agree we need to respond to their military build-up using Collins-class submarines. How do you explain that contradiction?
Not their military, anyone's military build-up. In other words, what a defence policy is about is prudence. You prudentially cover your bases. The point of the Collins was to cover us against any comers, not the Chinese. See, remember this, when I did the Collins with Kim Beazley in the late 80s, China's defence was nowhere. Chinese military was nowhere. I mean, I don't mean anywhere, I mean nowhere. But we built the Collins-class submarines prudently so that we could pretend a country, and that's still the same today. And the thing is, what would you rather? 8 Collins-class boats or 15 at sea permanently, or 3 nuclear boats. You've got to remember, they're only firing traditional torpedoes. They're not firing nuclear torpedoes. So there we are, the massive maritime reaches of Australia. We've got the 3 boats out there, and I hope you Chinese are quaking in your boots. I mean, I'm sure they'll be quaking in their boots.
Mr Keating, we're out of time. I have received a message saying that Penny Wong actually launched Peter Hartcher's book, contrary to what you said.
Oh, no, she launched it, but she didn't put the sticker on the back, And I had many people saying to me, please don't hop into her. Please don't hop into her. And it was with all the restraint I could muster that I didn't.
Well, you seem to have hopped into her a fair bit today. Thank you for your observations and thank you for joining us at the Press Club today.
OK, thank you so much.